Good evening. Welcome to Scotland at 7 with me, Gordon Ross. It's the 23rd of March today. Joining me on the programme this evening is disabled rights activist and advocate Kate Monahan. Welcome back to the programme. Kate, how are you?
Very good. Thank you for having me.
Okay, Kate, we will be talking later on in the programme, but before we do that, to the coronavirus update first of all. And as of 2 o'clock today, a total of 1,780,813 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and the UK's government's regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,566,430 have been confirmed negative. 214,383 have tested positive. There are 495 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. This, of course, is an underestimate of the number of cases because not everyone with the virus displays the symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There were 7 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive today. The number of patients in Scotland who've died from complications caused by COVID-19 infections now stands at 7,559. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 341 were in hospital last night, 28 of whom were in intensive care. Now, as of 8 a.m. this morning, 2,214,672 people had received their first dose of COVID-19 vaccination, and 235,671 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 126,284 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 112 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. And now to the ONS update. The percentage of people testing positive for COVID-19 has decreased in England and Wales in recent weeks, but the rate of decrease appears to have slowed in Wales. The positivity rate appears level in Northern Ireland and has appeared to show some increase in Scotland, the week ending the 13th of March 2021. The hospital admissions rate in England also continued to decrease in the latest week, ending on the 14th of March. The number of registered deaths involving COVID-19 in England and Wales decreased in the week ending March the 12th. The number of all deaths registered in England and Wales in the week ending the 12th of March 2021 was 10,987. Of these deaths, 13.7%, that's 1,501, mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, a decrease on the previous week. The total number of deaths registered was 4.4% less than the 5-year average. In February, COVID-19 was the leading cause of death in both England and Wales. And now to the Scottish Government's handling of harassment complaints, and subsequent judicial review was seriously flawed, according to a report issued today by Holyrood's Committee on the Scottish Government's handling of harassment complaints. The committee was established to find out what went wrong with the Scottish Government's procedure for dealing with harassment complaints, which ultimately led to the Government conceding a legal challenge in January 2019 brought by the former First Minister. The committee has now made a series of recommendations to ensure that what went wrong never happens again, and there can be confidence in future complaints processes. The SNP members of the committee issued a statement welcoming the unanimous conclusions and recommendations of the report. However, they pointed to substantial concerns that unfortunate behaviour by some committee members will have a chilling and counterproductive effect on the primary objective of protecting the best interests of women. The statement said, "We fear that the conduct over several months of some members, their skewed focus, overt politicisation and lamentable disregard for complainers will dissuade women from coming forward in the future. That is a matter of the deepest regret." The Scottish Greens co-leader, Patrick Harvie MSP, said that some members of the Parliamentary Committee had prejudged the evidence, called for resignations before listening to it, betrayed the original complainers in the sexual harassment case, and leaked their own conclusions to the media. Mr Harvey said that MSPs who broke the code of conduct brought our Parliament into disrepute and should resign. Well, Kate, I'm sure, like many of us, you've been following this saga, which seems to have gone on for years, doesn't it? But the latest saga in the saga is, of course, that Nicola Sturgeon was cleared yesterday of misconduct. And this is the report of the Committee of MSPs. Now, Patrick Harvey has not pulled his punches, has he? He's really well wired into them about what they did wrong and the leaking of information to the press in particular. Were you shocked to find out that members of the committee had been leaking this kind of information?
I think I absolutely was. I actually agreed with much of what Patrick Harvey said. I think it is to do with the integrity of our civic processes, of our governance, and we have to, as a society, be able to have faith in the procedures, in the processes, in what happens in Parliament when something does go wrong. And I think that the points that were made about the judgment prejudgment, as it were, are very significant. And the fact that people who are in a trusted position to have been handling such a serious and sensitive matter, as you say, that had gone on for such a long time, and that there was such focus on media focus and national focus, international focus even, that had to be absolutely beyond reproach. It had to have been done, it should have been done incredibly professionally without any questions over its integrity. And so I think the people on the committee have let us all down in the sense that that's now undermined any outcome or any kind of significant sort of discussion about what went wrong for the women at the heart of all of this, really. Yeah, it was quite an unedifying spectacle, really.
Do you think, Kate, that the leaks that came out from these various members of the committee, who are not named in any of the comments made by politicians today, do you think that those are going to dissuade women from coming forward with harassment complaints in the future, especially if they think that their names are going to be leaked to the press by politicians?
I absolutely can't see how it could possibly have any other effect than exactly that. That if you are a victim of anything and you bring that concern forward, whatever organisation you work for, you have to be taken seriously. The process has to be fair, robust. It has to stand up to scrutiny, but it also has to protect you as you're going through that, and it has to protect everyone involved in that kind of a case. I think it's not done our public life any favors, but I think in particular, were you a person in that position in any organisation now watching this, would you come forward? Would you speak up? And anything that stops people telling their truth and it being addressed and actioned is undesirable for all of us in society. Well, it's really sad, actually.
Kate, of course, the women complainers in this case were not the only people whose names were leaked to the press, were they? It's well established now that somebody, somewhere, leaked Mr. Salmon's name to the press while this confidential inquiry was going on. Do you think there's also a bit of damage being done to particularly people who are being complained about? Because until these complaints are fully investigated and the facts are known, the person who's being complained against can have their entire reputation dragged through the press as well, can't they?
Mm. And I think that is something that we should be discussing as a society about our legal processes entirely, because there's always been much debate, especially in rape cases, as to whether or not the person accused should be named at all in public or certainly before a verdict, in the same way as the victims shouldn't. But I think it does add again to the discussion about protection, that if it's all handled properly and isn't out in the public domain, and this was a particularly public example, I accept, but that actually the both sides in having that privacy might be able to behave differently, that the whole tone of it, nature of it might be different. And I think that the public spectacle has added a dimension to this case that's not helped anybody
There,
at
there,
all.
there have been some calls, both in the mainstream media and also social media, Kate, for the people who leak this information to the press to also be the subject of an inquiry, because in every respect they also have broken a code of conduct in leaking confidential information to the press this way and using it for political purposes. There surely has to be some consequence to that as well.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the parliamentary, the sort of code of conduct is, but it must surely include a kind of integrity for these types of situations. If you are called to sit on a committee of this nature, of this significance, with this amount of scrutiny, you should, surely as an acting MSP in particular, you should have your own personal integrity in play as well, you would hope, so that the whole process can be trusted by the public, because ultimately that's what's important, is that what comes out of it all is the people can feel an assurance that if and when things go wrong, and they will in all organisations, in all human interactions, that those things are handled properly, carefully, with an appropriate degree of respect and restraint, and certainly not politicised, which is what seems to have happened in this inquiry. And to those of us that are lay people on the outside, it is very off-putting, but also completely undermining. It's very hard to have respect for a process when the people that are supposed to be the champions of that process are so openly behaving in a way that's extremely questionable. So although it seems, I don't want to call for an inquiry into an inquiry, and that's perhaps,
Yeah.
it is a matter of concern, a legitimate matter of concern for all of us in Scotland, in society, that we should have people in these positions and trust that they will behave in an appropriate manner. And I think particularly calling for the First Minister's resignation before she'd even given any evidence, and making sort of statements to the press about guilt or otherwise in advance of that, it's unacceptable. It is unacceptable. It should certainly be unacceptable, you would hope.
You would hope so. James Hamilton, QC, the man who was charged with actually conducting the independent inquiry, surely is the very man to have a look at the behaviour of these MSPs, because his job effectively is to make sure that the procedures for dealing with harassment, bullying, and sexual harassment cases within the employment and in Parliament and Holyrood. It's his job, actually, to make sure that those rules are tightened up if necessary. And I'm wondering perhaps if there isn't here a very obvious case where the code or the guidelines having been followed by this committee have clearly been broken. I think one of the most, for me anyway, the most appalling things was that whoever it was who was leaking this information to the press was doing so through their own social media accounts. So I mean, clearly they didn't think there was going to be any consequence to their behaviour. Surely there should be consequences for that kind of behaviour.
I mean, there's so many issues that you've picked up on there. I mean, for me, it was the external review that was important, because I think there is so much self-interested politicking going on the committee that we've seen for ourselves. So the judgment by the external neutral review was much more important. And I think, as he was somebody that was appointed initially by Alex Salmond and continued by Nicola Sturgeon, actually that lends a degree of sort of reassurance of neutrality, because he's not presumably in either camp, and that's helpful, I think. But in terms of public life at the moment, I don't think there's much evidence. I mean, certainly in the Westminster government, it's very difficult to see any issue at all that they might consider they need resign for. You know, Ruth Davidson today was challenging the First Minister on the £500,000 cost of the court case. But, Priti Patel has just cost the taxpayer almost that much money for bullying people who were employed in a workplace to whom they had a duty of care, and we've had to, as taxpayers, carry that cost. The public purse has paid for that, and bullying is quite clearly a breach of ministerial code, and there's been no consequences for her, none for the Prime Minister, none for Matt Hancock, who've been found in court to have behaved improperly. And I think it just sets a really regrettable tone in public life to have these types of things going on and there be clearly no consequence. So I hope that there will be some reflection and perhaps some action towards committee members that have leaked things inappropriately in advance of their own official report. They've undermined themselves effectively.
Okay, Kate, thank you, Kate. That was a very fulsome reply. We're going to move on now to our next story, and a Tory no confidence vote. The Scottish Conservative no confidence motion calling for the resignation of First Minister Nicola Sturgeon was defeated in Scottish Parliament today, with Anna Sarwar and the Labour Party's MSPs all abstaining. Now, this, I think, was expected, Kate, wasn't it, that the Tories would be virtually on their own in wanting the First Minister to resign, especially in light of Mr James Hamilton's report being published yesterday exonerating the First Minister. Is this just a case of the Scottish Conservatives just trying to do anything they can to damage the First Minister?
I mean, it's certainly hard to view it in other terms. It certainly seems to have been a partisan move, a party political move. It was, as you say, the outcome was inevitable. They knew it was inevitable, so why were they still going through with it? And they didn't seem to learn from the fact that they tried to do that to John Swinney and it backfired. And I think this will actually backfire for them as well. And it actually garners support for the First Minister. So you wonder who's advising them and why they repeat these sort of self-harming behaviours. So I don't think they did land any punches on the First Minister. They certainly didn't get the results that they may have wanted, but certainly couldn't realistically have expected. And it does seem game playing, and that again undermines parliamentary civic life. So we're back to the same issues of, as the public watching all of this an edifying spectacle, what can we have faith in if they're going to use parliamentary time to play political games for no real reason? I thought it was disappointing to see.
Kate, I was just going to ask you, do you think that the purpose behind the Conservative, Scottish Conservatives' behaviour, and also in some recent years, the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party as well, that their main purpose in Holyrood is not to actually behave like politicians at all, but actually to make the Parliament seem less than it is. In other words, to try and infantilise it, to mock it, and to openly just, flout every rule and regulation and think they can get away with anything. It seems desperate. Do you think perhaps the Conservatives have just realised the writing's on the wall for the Union and are trying anything they can now?
I think I partly want to kind of giggle at that because it's so transparent, and yes, that I think that is exactly what they're doing. But it also is quite alarming because I think they are already taking powers away from the Scottish Parliament, and it may well be under attack. And so as a society, I think we need to be aware that we might need to defend our Scottish Parliament, whatever your party political views are. It's our democratic institution, it's our Parliament. And so nobody has the right to undermine it and disrespect it and use it for their own gain. But then I would also again say that, the spectacle of the Prime Minister coming to Prime Minister's questions once a week and basically asking questions and never answering any, and undermining Parliament in lots of similar ways. They quite regularly now just make announcements directly to the media and totally bypass parliamentary debate and scrutiny. and hear a Labour abstaining again, or
Yes.
there's not very effective opposition in either chamber, actually. So,
Yes, I think that the Labour Party seems to
very,
be abstaining its way into obscurity at the moment.
yeah.
Anyway, listen, Kate, we'll need to move on. The SNP is calling for an investigation into David Cameron's COVID cash lobbying. The SNP has called on the UK government to back a full independent investigation into the former Tory Prime Minister's so-called lobbying for COVID cash through text to the Chancellor's personal phone. It has been reported that David Cameron, an advisor and a shareholder in Greensill, sent multiple texts to Rishi Sunak asking for a government loan for the company through the COVID corporate financing facility to allow it to lend to clients. Granting Greensill access to the CCFF would break the rules, as lenders are not meant to borrow money through that programme. The SNP's shadow BEIS spokesman said that this is yet another example of Tory cronyism at the heart of Westminster, and has challenged the UK government in the House of Commons today to take steps to stamp it out by supporting an investigation into the apparent lobbying. The Parliamentary Undersecretary for the BEIS has failed to confirm support. Well, I guess, Kate, that comes as no surprise. Whenever the SNP demands anything of the Westminster Parliament, nothing happens, does it? And particularly something which would damage someone as I suppose, high profile as David Cameron. But to be lobbying for a loan for basically a company which lends money from an emergency support scheme is not only highly unethical, it's completely immoral, isn't it?
It's completely immoral, and it's more of the same of what we've seen all year. I think one of the most shocking and scandalous things about the COVID pandemic is how much some of these big business Tory crony donors have benefited. I mean, Rupert Soames and Dido Harding and their £37 billion for the most probably ineffective track and
Yes.
taste test on the planet, is quite shocking. And this is terrible too. And I think Tony Blair, in a way, is so connected and so able to use his platform as a former Prime Minister. But we mustn't forget that Matt Hancock's just been found guilty in a court. So has Boris Johnson has been found guilty in a court of misleading Parliament about the sort of distribution and procurement processes relating to the COVID pandemic. So it's rife amongst all of them. The elite bubble in Westminster has got richer and richer. The billionaires have made, I think, 40% or something between them during this last year alone. And I find it quite extraordinary that there isn't more outrage. It comes back again to media scrutiny and how do we hold these people to account in these roles? Matt Hancock's not going to resign. Boris Johnson certainly has no intention of resigning. And yet the hypocrisy of calling for our First Minister to resign, who has done nothing even remotely comparable at all in any way. And it's just quite an extraordinary discourse that's going on that means they can do what they want, benefit their friends. Matt Hancock gave a valuable contract to his neighbour who owned a pub.
Yeah,
They're not.
that was astonishing.
It's astonishing, but what happens about it? Where are the people that hold them to account? Should be the journalists, should be the democratic fourth estate in our society, and they just don't. They're part of the cronyism, part of the little bubble. They're all interconnected, and it's just depressing, frankly, the quality of and the calibre of our leadership at the moment. So I'm sad to see Tony Blair also part of it. I had sort of thought it was restricted to the cabinet, but clearly it's not, and it's just anybody who's connected enough and wealthy enough to have the ear of the government seems to expect to benefit personally, financially, and
And
that's a scandal. It's
I,
corruption. And
I was going to say, Kate, I heard it quoted in the mainstream press about 3 weeks ago that the money given to Dido Harding, I think it was what was it, 45 billion pounds or something for the track and trace system, is actually the third most expensive capital sort of expenditure of any government in the history of the world. I think it was behind only things like the American moonshot in terms of the amount of money thrown at it. And of course, none of it has actually seems to have resulted in anything, does it?
it's extraordinary. I mean, I'm actually quite lost for words. I don't know why we actually aren't out. Well, I do know why we're not out on the streets because we're not supposed to be in a pandemic. But I do wish people would speak up more, expect more from the media holding them to account, and expect more from the government and from politicians. They're in a position of responsibility and they're failing to deliver a sort of government of integrity. And it's almost like asset stripping the nation. At what point is
Yes.
that actually treasonous to do that? They're supposed to act in the best interest, do no harm to the people. They're meant to defend the people, the
Yeah.
well-being, the safety of the people, and to use a pandemic when we've got one of the highest death rates in a Western democracy to make money for their chums. It's disgraceful, actually. I find it it offends me deeply as a
I think it
citizen.
offends millions of us, Kate. But unfortunately, we're going to have to move on to our next story. And the next story takes us to Saudi Arabia. A top Saudi official had issued a death threat against the UN's Khashoggi investigator. A senior Saudi official issued what was perceived to be a death threat against the independent United Nations investigator Agnes Callamard after her investigation into the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. In an interview with The Guardian, the outgoing special rapporteur for extrajudicial killings said that the UN colleague alerted her in January 2020 that a senior Saudi official had twice threatened in a meeting with other senior UN officials in Geneva that month to have Callamard taken care of if she was not reined in by the UN. Asked how the comment was perceived by her Geneva-based colleagues, Callamard said, "A death threat. That was how it was understood." Callamard, a French national and human rights expert, who will this month take her new post as the Secretary General of Amnesty International, was the first official to publicly investigate and publish a detailed report into the 2018 murder of Khashoggi, a prominent former insider who used his column at the Washington Post to write critically about the Saudi government. Callamard's 100-page report, published in June 2019, concluded that there was credible evidence that the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and other senior Saudi officials were liable for the killing and called the murder an international crime. The Biden administration has since released its own unclassified report, which concluded that Prince Mohammed had approved the murder. The Saudi government has denied the killing, which occurred in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, which was ordered by the future king. Now, this is a remarkable story, Kate, apart from the fact that Mr. Khashoggi was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and it was at the behest, at least, of somebody within the Saudi administration. But for them now to be issuing death threats against a UN official, surely this has got to cross some kind of line.
It's stunning. It's shocking. There are so many human rights activists across the world, so many journalists who are murdered, and there's something like nearly 400 journalistic deaths a year in the world.
That's
There's
incredible.
I know there's some very, very brave voices, and I think we don't stand enough up for people who are prepared to take a stand, do the right thing, to make the world a better place for us all. And it is up to our. I'm glad if Biden's government's going to do something, because these people deserve to be protected, and you can't expect, this kind of hostility and aggression in this sort of arena. It's just entirely awful, and I wish her well, and I hope everything, is resolved peacefully and safely. It's an
Um,
awful story.
Kate, there was one thing that came through to me in the report as I was quoting it there, and that were the words used by the Saudi official that Ms. Khalard was to be reined in, to be controlled. There seemed to be an element of, what should we call it, misogyny in these comments. Perhaps if Ms. Khalard had been a man, these threats wouldn't have been made.
That's so true in so many areas of public life, isn't it? I mean, it's reminiscent of our discussion earlier about our own First Minister. You there are so many issues where I feel like publicly kind of exposed women are vulnerable to death threats, to attacks. We have it here in our politics, we have it across the world. And we need to protect women in public roles. They deserve it. We need them. We need more balance. We need more kind of democratic accountability and a more representative political discourse and parliaments and women that get to these senior roles to have actually made it to get there and then to face this kind of thing. It's horrendous. And as you say, it does seem to have a misogynistic and a sort of physically aggressive element that you do wonder, would it have been applied in the same way to a man? We can't know because it isn't in this case, but the whole thing is alarming.
Were you surprised, Kate, having read through this report now, the UN has obviously promoted Ms. Calamard to another post. In fact, I beg your pardon, she's moved to Amnesty International to head that up. But it seemed to me that what was missing from this was any kind of action or response from the UN. Surely they should have at least threatened some kind of sanction against the Saudi Arabian regime.
You would have hoped so, yes. But I wish her well at Amnesty, and I'm glad that probably for her own safety, it may be a good thing. But it's very sad if it's had to happen because of that. I don't think people, the First Minister today made a wonderful statement where she said, "You can't bully me out of my job." And I hope that no women can be bullied out of their job by any threats, whether they're political, verbal, or physical. Women should be respected in the roles that they've achieved, and that's missing far too often.
Of course, women's safety is very much in our minds at the moment, having been reporting on the case of the women complainers in the Alex Salmond case. I noticed yesterday that when Nicola Sturgeon was doorstepped by the media outside of her house, they made no effort at all to blur out the number plate on her car. Now, that is standard procedure, usually for every national leader, that anything that identifies their car or their home or anything like that is normally kept out of the television. But yesterday it wasn't. Is this, again, just another way of trying to make a female politician feel uncomfortable or exposed or vulnerable?
Well, they did make her exposed and vulnerable through that action. They did that. So she must feel it, and my heart goes out to her at the moment. And I just feel as though it's quite it's going to be quite a rough couple of months up to the election.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of scrutiny on Scottish politics, and the union is under threat, and we're going to probably see quite a lot of the sort of weaponry, whether that's
Yeah.
not physical, but thrown at it. And I think it's sad, but I totally admire her dignity and the manner in which she deals with these things. Her press conference, she's under attack the entire time. She must be so exhausted a year on from the beginning of COVID, and I've got great respect for her management to have retained the strength to keep going. I think she will.
I was just going to say, Kate, let's hope that she can find the time to take some time out. Sadly, time is against us tonight, Kate, as well. We have to move on to our next story, this time to America. A Colorado mass shooting suspect has been charged with 10 counts of murder. A 21-year-old man faces 10 counts of murder in connection with yesterday's mass shooting at a Colorado grocery store. But his motive remains unclear, the authorities said today. The suspect, identified by police as Ahmad al-Alawi Alissa of Arvada, Colorado, was in stable condition after suffering a leg wound in an exchange of gunfire with responding police officers at the King Soopers outlet in Boulder, about 28 miles northwest of Denver on Monday afternoon. The 10 victims, whose names were released at a news conference, range in age from 20 to 65 and include Eric Talley, 51, a veteran of the Boulder Police Force, Denny Strong, 20, Nevin Stanicic, 23, Ricky Oles, 21, Trelona Bartkowak, 49, Suzanne Fountain, 59, Terry Leaker, 51, Kevin Maloney, 61, Lynn Murray, 62, and Jodie Waters, 65. The bloodshed marked the country's second mass shooting in a week. The gunman went on a killing spree on March the 16th in the Atlanta area, fatally shooting 8 people at a three-day spas before he was arrested. The investigators said that they were confident Alissa had acted alone, although they did not offer any details on what might have motivated the massacre. Kate, now we know that President Biden has already passed 2 bills on gun control, especially concerning things like automatic self-loading weaponry. But America seems to have, it's almost like a disease, the gun crime in America, but mass shootings seem to happen on a weekly basis. It's hard for us in Scotland to imagine what it's like to see a mass shooting in your country every single week. But what can the Americans do about this? Their constitution guarantees people the right to bear arms, but sadly, the people who are bearing these arms obviously are not checked out that thoroughly, are they?
I think it resonated particularly strongly following the sort of anniversary of the Dunblane disastrous sort of events in Scotland a long time ago now, and it's to the credit, I believe, of our culture that hasn't happened again, and hopefully never will. And it's the repetitious nature of this. It just recurs and recurs and recurs. And children go to school in America with backpacks that are bulletproof.
I know
Imagine that you're buying a 5-year-old a backpack that has a bulletproof outer coating to send them to school. It's just buying. It's beyond. I mean, if I could say anything about it, I would link it back to the previous conversation about Tony Blair and Dido Harding and the sort of corruption of government. And I do believe the NRA are too dominant. They're too.
This is the National Rifle Association of America.
Yes. And they're very politically strong in terms of lobbying American governments. And American governments just do not seem able to stand up to them. Even Obama, I mean, remember Obama in tears and the passion with which he tried to do things. And the NRA are stronger than the president. And that's probably the most significant issue, that if you have got a situation where that's the truth of it, then how will it change? How can they change it? And everything else down from that.
Case, I was just going to say, I guess the only way to change it would be to change the American Constitution. Sadly, I don't think that's going to happen. Anyway, we have to move on, I'm afraid. And the next story is the priorities for heart disease services. Improving diagnosis, treatment and care for people with heart disease is central to a new 5-year plan. Developed in close collaboration with the third sector, clinicians and people with lived experience, the Heart Disease Action Plan 2021 sets out the Scottish Government's priorities for tackling heart disease. It includes a focus on addressing risk factors like high blood pressure, addressing variation in access to timely diagnosis and treatment for heart conditions, and ensuring that people are supported to live well with their condition. This includes a focus on increased emotional and psychological support. The plan will also address the crucial issue of cardiac data, although the establishment of a Scottish cardiac establishment of a Scottish cardiac audit. This will enable an increased focus on the effective use of data to support learning and improvement about cardiac services. Now, with heart attacks being one of the big three killers traditionally in Scotland, it's interesting that the Scottish Government has chosen now to change the way these things are done and to try and improve the outcomes for people who are at risk from cardiac problems and who end up having to live with them. What do you think is the most significant thing in this particular announcement today? The fact that they have a plan, or the fact that we even need a plan?
It's sad we need a plan, but I think it's um, another example, and we've talked before about this in disabilities, um, but of a more consultative approach with this government, and I think it's so much to be welcomed that they seek out lived experience. They speak to the people affected, and then the decision making is so much better for that. So I really welcome it. I think it's a fantastic sounding initiative, much needed. I hope that it has a positive impact on the rate of suffering. And I think it's worth us thinking at this point in a year into the pandemic that I saw a statistic recently that said that actually heart attacks have actually gone down a little bit in COVID. And they wonder if that's not the stress of workplace. So as much as we've all focused on the challenges of being at home and being isolated and the negative impacts of that, the upside is that work is very stressful for many people, and there are a
Indeed.
lot of, there are a lot of negative experiences in a workplace. So, and just the sort of endless nature of the regime of commuting and all of that stuff. Whether
Yeah.
there are other things we should learn and take away from this year, and sort of apply that as well to inform how we deal with things going forward, especially in a preventative approach. But a preventative approach has to be probably the most welcome, although obviously urgent care is also so significant for heart attacks in particular. But
Yeah.
we need to educate ourselves, change our behaviours, understand why this is happening in great numbers, and address it directly, I suppose.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your comments there, Kate. The next item is to do with over £8 million being made available for healthcare students. Nursing, midwifery, and allied health professional students will be able to access alternative clinical placements to support their practical education, which was disrupted by the coronavirus. Funding of £8 million will help to ease pressure on clinical placement capacity in health and social care settings to ensure that students gain the required practical skills, learning and practice hours for their studies. University staff will be able to deliver new placements and practical training using innovative technology with funding of £3.8 million. There will also be a 50% increase in the number of education staff who supervise students on clinical placement, with investment of £4.9 million. This includes more staff to support students in care homes and other health and social care settings. Now, obviously, Kate, the coronavirus has particularly affected the training of healthcare professionals of all kinds, but particularly health and social care, with its extended periods of close personal contact with the people that they are supporting. How do you think that this will help to improve things for them? They're saying they're going to provide more people to supervise and more opportunities for placement with new technology. They don't explain what the technology is, but let's assume that they have that. How important is it for people who are entering this profession to have these placements?
I think it's enormously helpful. I can't remember which ancient philosopher it was who said, if I hear something, I forget. If I see, I remember, and if I do, I understand, or something like that. And I
Yeah,
think in place training is so significant, and especially in the care sector, there is so much that's about human behaviour that
yes,
isn't in a textbook. It's to do with attitudes, behaviours, cultures. My own son is lucky enough to be in a Camp Hill community, and that what's important there is their ethos, the ethics, the motivations, the sort of the raison d'être, if you like, of what they're doing as a community, where they all live together, and it's not us and them, it's only ever us, and it's
yes.
wonderful. And so to have people to have opportunities of doing these sorts of things in a practical based way in a care or medical setting, I think it's a really welcome initiative. I can't think of a downside to it. So
I was going to say, Kate, just before we leave the subject, particularly social care and dealing with people in the later stages of life with dementia and other quite complicated conditions, requires a great deal of experience from people who've been doing the job a long time, because they develop all sorts of ways of of relating to the people in their care, and to making sure that they're happy, that they're not stressed, they're not anxious about anything. These are the personal skills that you can't really teach in a college, aren't they?
they are, and it's to do with the wealth of knowledge that experience-based placements can offer, the wealth of knowledge that is in your colleague within their life's journey, their work experience, their own knowledge base, and you can learn so much from somebody sort of modeling best practice, and you're working alongside them. So I hope the quality of it is really good, and the scrutiny and the monitoring of it is fabulous. And I hope that we can retain these people of a senior nature in the sector, for then young people to come through and learn and take over and carry forward the best practice if possible. And I hope, amongst other things, that the Prime Minister might find some money to pay everybody in the care and social and health sector a little bit more money when he's managed to afford a second aeroplane. As it seems he
We,
can't afford it more than 1% for the NHS.
yeah. Well, we can only
Take that.
hope, Kate. Kate,
Yeah.
Kate, I'm sorry, we have to move on. I'm afraid time is not on our side this evening. But there is good news today for Armed Forces charities. Armed Forces charities across Scotland will benefit from a new £1 million support fund. The Scottish Government fund will help the sector to offset the shortfall in income due to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. In May last year, a survey of the Scottish Charity Regulator found that 75% of charities had seen a negative impact on their finances as a result of COVID-19. Under the new initiative, armed forces charities that have suffered financially because of the pandemic can apply for funding to help them continue to deliver support services. The Scottish Government is currently working with partners to finalise the eligibility criteria to ensure the funding gets to where it is needed most. Further details of the one-year Armed Forces Third Sector Resilience Fund will be published ahead of the launch expected in April. Again, a good news story, Kate. Armed Forces charities traditionally rely obviously on public donations, and those have been drastically hit by the fact that so many people have not been able to work. So this is obviously great news for the Armed Forces charities.
It's fabulous news for the armed forces charities. And, I think people forget. So, as a sort of disability campaigner and activist, a
Yeah,
lot of people are not born disabled. They come to their disability through different routes, and veterans are a large community, as you've just touched on. So are older people. And there are some magnificent charities in our society doing wonderful, wonderful work. But I would just say, with regards to your later comments about traditionally they've been supported through charities. I question whether that's right, whether that's
mm,
valid. If you go to war, which I'm a pacifist, but if you go to war on behalf of your country and you are injured, life-changing injuries is the horrifying phrase,
yes.
then doesn't the state have a duty to take care of you when you come home? It shouldn't be dependent on charities that have hit and miss vulnerable sort of financial resources, and in times like this last year suffer because everybody's suffering. It should perhaps be the role of the state that engage in these wars and send people out to be injured in this way, that perhaps should fully take up the resourcing of looking after them when they get home.
Well,
I
we'll
know
just
that's
have to.
probably
I was going to say, Kate, that if we do have a referendum shortly and decide we want to become independent, that the Scottish Government will be able to do exactly that with its armed forces. I'm certain that they will be taking on board the comments of yourself and other people who, obviously, many people in Scotland feel the same way as you do. Anyway, I'm afraid we have to move on now. And our next story is also about victims, but this time this is about support for victims of crime. Victims of crime will receive support provided by the first payments of a fund that takes money from offenders. 5 organisations are sharing in £157,000 from the Victim Surcharge Fund to provide practical help for victims. This includes support such as emergency household, food, utility or clothing expenses, and helping with the costs of repair or replacing damaged property or goods. It can also be used to provide new windows and locks for victims of house break-ins, or to cover travel costs, for example, to places of safety or to attend court. The fund is drawn from additional financial levies imposed on all offenders who receive a court fine. The payments have been made into the fund since the regulations establishing the victim surcharge were passed on November the 25th, 2019. The payments have been made as more than £7 million of grant funding for victim support organisations in 2021 and 22 was also announced. This includes extended funding for Victim Support Scotland, Action Against Stalking, and organisations providing support for the victims of human trafficking. Another good news story, Kate. This is becoming a bit of a habit with the Scottish Government, isn't it? Looking after, this time, the victims of crime.
It's fantastic, isn't it? How lucky we are to live in a country with a government that's doing all these really rather amazing things and innovative things to support people who are often the most vulnerable or in marginalised communities. And this is again very welcome. How could it not be welcome? It's a shame that we need it as the last story, but we do. And I have nothing but gratitude and welcome for this kind of support for people who've suffered.
Kate, for many years, people have said that crime shouldn't pay. But in this particular case, it's the criminals who are paying the victims. Surely that also is a measure of extra justice, which is being extracted from these offenders and given to the victims whom they have offended against. I think surely that is a balance of justice.
It's an interesting concept, the sort of natural justice approach. But also, I think there are lots of crimes where we don't need to incarcerate people at great expense who often have a worse life journey when they come out. So perhaps this sort of thing could begin to replace custodial sentences where there is actual reparation for the original crime that's meaningful, that, as you say, is a sort of a restoration, really, a reparation, and that might have more meaning and more legitimacy, perhaps, for both the victim but also the offender, because it's a direct consequence and a more important one. It's a less arbitrary, disconnected sort of.
I was going to ask you, Kate, do you think this maybe marks a divergence from the traditional punishment of offenders and moves away from sort of punishing them and hurting them, and rather than doing that, actually make them do something to repair the damage that they have caused to the lives of their victims?
I don't see how that could possibly not be positive, because being stuck into a jail and given no support, quite often the people in prisons have had the most traumatic life journey to that point, and we should recognise that. I think people who aren't violent and aren't a threat to people physically, because we put them away for the safety of others, we could look at doing different things, more sort of innovative things, more investment in their education, in their inclusion in society. I'm glad that citizens in jail are allowed to vote now, and if they're under a year's sentence and things, and that sort of approach seems to me that then somebody will have less of a negative impact and cost and all of those things going forward, because there'll be hope and there'll be a future, and we could do far more to invest in those people in their lives and in their own futures, that it will benefit us all.
So you think perhaps addressing the cause of the crime as well as trying to create reparation for the victims is the way to go?
Well, I just feel like it's old-fashioned to just see everything black and white like we
Yeah.
do, like this person is bad, this person is good. No, but that's just, it's not really real. It doesn't match any of our stories. And, who knows how any of us would act faced with adverse circumstances. And it's very easy to be very judgmental and condemning. It's much harder to be forgiving and to engage and to kind of problem solve and look at it in a way and say, well, what can we do to make this better, to make both these lives better, the victim, but also the perpetrator of the crime.
Okay, well, let's leave that subject now to our final story this evening, and marking a somber note today at the end of the programme. Today, of course, marks a National Day of Reflection, which was marked at the Scottish Parliament. The presiding officer was joined by the deputy presiding officers and the parliamentary party leaders on Garden Lobby's steps at 12 noon today to mark a National Day of Reflection. Later in the debating chamber, the time for reflection by Dr. Richard Holloway reflected on the events of the past year and what was the final time for reflection of the presiding officer Ken McIntosh's tenure. There then followed a series of tributes in the debating chamber with a statement from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, MSP, followed by contributions from parliamentary party leaders. Now, of course, Kate, this is also the final day of speeches and politicking in Holyrood, but it has marked a very sombre occasion this week, hasn't it? Oh, I beg your pardon, there is more in Holyrood tomorrow. So there's First Minister's questions tomorrow. I've just been corrected. However, marking the event of over 128,000 deaths is something which I guess a year ago we would never have imagined.
No, it's quite extraordinary, and I feel quite angry that the Westminster government has refused an inquiry into why we do have such a huge number of deaths in this country, and the mistakes that were made early on, the lack of attending Cobra meetings, taking it seriously, shutting down, but then now we're potentially going to have another spike ahead of us, and it's unbelievable. It's been so badly managed. I know why they don't want to have an inquiry, but I honestly believe they should. And I would just draw attention to the contrast between the daily commitment of our own First Minister every single day. She's there, she's doing the job, she's speaking to the people, and our Prime Minister, who has been largely absent and doesn't seem to take any personal responsibility or account for what happens and how many people have died. You've got to start to wonder, is there a number at which he would consider his own position? How many people have to die before he does think he might have done something inadequate in his job? I don't know. So I find it really sad that we're a year in with this bigger number of deaths down compared to other countries. It's just so awful and
Yeah.
indefensible.
You may,
And
re-
it's
I don't know if you remember, Kate, but at the beginning of the pandemic, I think the government's chief medical officer, I can't remember if it was Chris Whitty, but one of the scientific advisors to the British government actually said that the highest mortality rate that they predicted from COVID-19 was 50,000, and they didn't expect it to get as high as that. It's now 128,000. It's more than 150% higher than that. So something clearly went wrong.
And as a percentage of our population compared to other countries, it's a terrifying number, and it's not yet under full control. It's not over. We're not in the clear. It's not something that anybody is saying this is the end of it, even with the vaccine rollout, and
Yeah.
and that's quite extraordinary. And I heard one of the ministers, I can't remember which one, saying he started to say, "Well, you can't compare us to New Zealand because they're an island country," and then dawned on him, oh, actually, so are we. And
Wasn't
why
Dominic
should
Raab, was it?
probably?
Well, listen, Kate, I'm afraid we have completely run out of time for this evening's programme, but thank you so much for being an excellent guest this evening. Let me just remind our viewers that we are having a major crowdfunder at the moment, so if you would like to help Broadcasting Scotland to continue to make programmes like this and others, you can do so by following the screen directions at the moment, and you can make an individual donation, you can join as a supporter and give regularly, or you can volunteer. But that is about it. I beg your pardon. We do have a special program coming up tomorrow night, so so make sure and tune in at 7 o'clock. I can't tell you who our guest is, but we have a special mystery guest tomorrow evening. Anyway, from myself and from Kate Monahan, who I just want to say thank you to again. A very good evening. Have a good night.
Thank you.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes,
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.
Hey.